When Mike Foster discovered that his neighbor, Diana, had taken over his garage and claimed it was part of a fabricated community storage initiative, he knew something was deeply wrong. Diana, a manipulative HOA leader, had spent years bending rules and bullying residents into silence. But this time, she underestimated her target. Armed with evidence, allies, and unshakable resolve, Mike fought back, uncovering corruption that shook the entire neighborhood. And wait until you hear how justice was served in this explosive battle for fairness and integrity. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind that invites you to linger a little longer over your coffee. Mike Foster stood in his driveway, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of leaves rustling in the breeze. For years, this suburban neighborhood had been his refuge, a place where he could raise his two kids, tinker in his garage, and relive memories of his father through the tools they once used together. But that tranquility was about to shatter. As he approached his garage, something felt off. The door wasn't closed all the way, leaving a small gap. His gut churned, a sense of unease creeping over him. Sliding the door open, Mike froze. Boxes were out of place, shelves looked rummaged through, and several tools were missing entirely. It wasn't just the mess. It was the unmistakable feeling of invasion. Someone had been here. While Mike tried to piece together what could have happened, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Oh, good morning, Mike." Diana Reed, his neighbor, and one of the more vocal members of the HOA, stood on the sidewalk holding a clipboard. She had that self-satisfied smile Mike had come to associate with trouble. "Morning, Diana," Mike replied, forcing calm into his voice. "Did you see anyone near my garage last night? Looks like someone's been in here." Diana's smile didn't waver. In fact, it grew wider. "Oh, I thought you knew. Your garage is part of the HOA's new community storage initiative. It's for everyone's benefit, really. Some of us needed extra space, and since your garage wasn't being fully utilized, we thought—" "You thought?" Mike cut her off, his voice rising. "Who gave you permission to decide that my garage was up for grabs?" Diana's tone turned condescending, as if she were speaking to a child. "Well, it's all in the bylaws, Mike. We're working to make the neighborhood better for everyone, and your contribution is greatly appreciated." Mike's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His garage wasn't just a storage space, it was part of his family's legacy. The idea that anyone, let alone Diana, had the audacity to invade it left him furious. "I didn't agree to this. Whatever you're talking about, it isn't in the bylaws I signed." Diana shrugged, clearly unbothered. "If you have any concerns, you can bring them up at the next HOA meeting. But really, Mike, we're just trying to foster a sense of community." As Diana walked away, clipboard tucked under her arm, Mike stood in stunned silence. He couldn't believe what he'd just heard. The very people meant to maintain harmony in the neighborhood were justifying theft and trespassing under the guise of community improvement. Later that evening, still seething, Mike scoured the HOA documents he'd kept since moving in. Hours passed, but there was no mention of a community storage initiative. It was a fabrication. Determined to set things straight, he marked his calendar for the next HOA meeting. If they thought they could walk over him, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. But as he closed the file and stared at the cluttered mess of his garage, one thought nagged at him. If they could do this to him, how many others had they bullied into submission? The calm life he cherished was slipping away, and it seemed Diana and the HOA were just getting started. Late into the evening, Mike sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by HOA bylaws and an untouched cup of coffee. The invasion of his garage still weighed heavily on his mind. Determined to find answers, he scoured every page, searching for anything resembling the community storage initiative Diana had mentioned. But as he flipped through the documents, it became clear. There was no such policy. Diana had fabricated the entire thing. The next morning, Mike's frustration turned into fury. His garage, once again, had been invaded. This time, new items were scattered inside, boxes labeled D. Reed personal items, a suitcase, and a child's bike. Diana had not only ignored his protest, but escalated her intrusion. It felt like a deliberate attempt to push him into submission. Fed up, Mike marched to Diana's house and knocked firmly. When she opened the door, her ever-present smug smile greeted him. "Morning, Mike. Lovely to see you," she chirped. "What's going on, Diana?" Mike demanded. You're filling my garage with your stuff now. This has to stop. Diana waved him off as if his anger was unwarranted. Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's all been approved by the HOA. Your garage is the perfect space for the community storage initiative. Approved? By who? Show me the paperwork, Mike said, his voice rising. Diana's tone turned condescending. Mike, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. If you're that concerned, bring it up at the next HOA meeting. With that, she shut the door, leaving Mike seething on her porch. Determined to protect what was his, Mike installed security cameras in and around his garage. Within 24 hours, the footage revealed the truth. Diana and her friends were repeatedly entering the garage, rearranging his belongings, and storing their own. It wasn't just an overreach. It was blatant trespassing. Armed with the evidence, Mike filed a police report and presented the footage to the HOA. But instead of addressing the issue, the HOA dismissed it as miscommunication and sent Mike a notice threatening fines for obstructing community initiatives. The sheer audacity of their response left Mike stunned. Feeling isolated, Mike turned to his neighbors for support. Many were sympathetic but afraid to get involved, worried about potential retaliation. However, Mrs. Garcia, an elderly widow who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, invited Mike into her cozy home. I know what you're going through, she said, as she poured him a cup of tea. Diana's been pulling these stunts for years, and most people are too scared to stand up to her. From a small drawer, Mrs. Garcia pulled out a folder of old HOA documents. She's been rewriting the rules to suit herself, intimidating anyone who questions her. She even tried to force me to sell part of my garden, saying it didn't meet community standards. As Mike leafed through the papers, his frustration was replaced by determination. The documents showed a clear pattern of manipulation and abuse. It wasn't just his fight anymore. Diana had been bullying residents for years. With Mrs. Garcia's support and the evidence in hand, Mike knew what he had to do. Diana and the HOA had underestimated him, but their reckoning was coming. The autumn air carried a quiet resolve as Mike walked through his neighborhood, determined to find others who had been wronged by Diana and the HOA. He couldn't shake the feeling that his battle wasn't an isolated one. If Diana had the audacity to claim his garage, what else had she done to others? Knocking on doors, Mike met a mix of responses. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, muttering excuses about being busy. Others nodded sympathetically but quickly closed their doors, afraid of drawing Diana's attention. Yet, amidst the hesitance, there were glimmers of hope. One neighbor, Mr. Patel, reluctantly admitted that Diana had fined him repeatedly for violating lawn maintenance rules despite his yard being impeccably kept. Another neighbor shared how she was pressured into paying unnecessary fees to avoid conflicts. The turning point came when Mike revisited Mrs. Garcia. Seated in her cozy living room with the familiar scent of lavender, she laid out more documents. Diana's been doing this for years, she said, her voice firm. She manipulates the rules to suit her needs, and no one stands up to her because they're scared of retaliation. Mike flipped through the papers and saw a pattern. Arbitrary fines, vague bylaws, and even instances of Diana commandeering common areas for her personal use. This wasn't just about his garage. It was about years of unchecked power. With a growing list of grievances, Mike organized a meeting at his house. Over coffee and a shared sense of injustice, a small group of neighbors came together. They shared their stories, unlawful fines, threats, and relentless harassment. For the first time, they felt united. Together, they drafted a formal complaint against Diana and the HOA, backed by Mrs. Garcia's documents and Mike's video evidence. But Diana wasn't going down without a fight. Days later, Mike woke to find flyers distributed throughout the neighborhood. The bold text accused him of hoarding dangerous materials in his garage, painting him as a hazard to the community. The lies stung, but Mike refused to let them derail him. "Can you believe this?" he said, holding up one of the flyers during the next meeting with his neighbors. "She's trying to turn everyone against me." Mrs. Garcia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We know the truth, Mike, and now it's time to make sure everyone else does too." Mike consulted a lawyer, sharing everything he'd gathered: security footage, neighbors' testimonies, and the HOA's own tangled records. The lawyer's eyes widened as she reviewed the evidence. "You've got a strong case here," she said. "Diana's been abusing her position, and it's time someone held her accountable." As Mike left the lawyer's office, the weight of the battle ahead settled on him. But this time, he didn't feel alone. The neighbors who had once stayed silent now stood beside him, ready to expose the truth. Together, they were more than just individuals. They were a force Diana hadn't anticipated. The fight for justice had only just begun. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people settled into their seats, curious about the case that had shaken the neighborhood. Mike sat at his table, his lawyer beside him, surrounded by binders of evidence. Across the room, Diana Reed entered with her usual air of confidence, a slight smirk playing on her lips as she whispered to her legal team. But for the first time, Mike noticed something different. Her shoulders weren't quite as square, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. The pressure was finally catching up with her. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, and the case began. Mike's lawyer wasted no time presenting the evidence. First came the security footage, clear, undeniable proof of Diana and her friends entering Mike's garage without permission, moving his belongings, and storing their own. The judge leaned forward as the videos played, his expression hardening with each clip. Then came the outdated HOA documents provided by Mrs. Garcia. Mike's lawyer explained how Diana had manipulated bylaws over the years, creating loopholes to justify her actions and intimidate homeowners. The room grew tense as the lawyer laid out instance after instance of Diana's overreach. And then came the bombshell. Financial records revealed that Diana had been misusing HOA funds for years, funneling money meant for community projects into her personal accounts. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the judge reviewed the evidence. Diana's confidence visibly crumbled, her smirk replaced by a look of panic. When it was Diana's turn to speak, her excuses fell flat. She claimed the community storage initiative was a misunderstood effort to help the neighborhood and insisted the financial discrepancies were errors. But her words carried no weight against the mountain of evidence Mike's team had built. The turning point came when Mrs. Garcia took the stand. With quiet strength, she recounted how Diana had tried to bully her into selling part of her garden and how neighbors had been too afraid to fight back. Her testimony painted a clear picture of Diana's tactics, leaving no doubt about her pattern of abuse. The judge delivered his verdict with firm authority. Diana was found guilty of trespassing, defamation, and misappropriation of HOA funds. She was ordered to pay substantial damages to Mike and reimburse his legal fees. The HOA itself was mandated to revise its policies to prevent further abuse and restore trust among residents. Most importantly, Diana was removed from her position on the HOA board, her reputation in ruins. As the gavel struck, Mike felt a wave of relief wash over him. Justice had been served, not just for him, but for everyone Diana had wronged. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered around Mike, offering congratulations and expressing their gratitude for his courage. Even those who had initially stayed silent now spoke up, inspired by his determination. Diana left the courthouse without meeting anyone's gaze, her once commanding presence reduced to a shadow. The neighborhood would finally have a chance to rebuild, free from her influence. As Mike returned home that evening, he looked at his garage, not just as a space for tools and memories, but as a symbol of the fight for what was right. He had stood up, and he had won. The news of Mike's courtroom victory spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, sparking conversations on every street corner. Residents who had long felt powerless under Diana's rule now felt emboldened. Stories of her overreach began to surface, as if a dam had broken. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact with Mike now waved at him with a newfound respect, and many stopped by to thank him personally. One chilly morning, as the autumn leaves crunched underfoot, Mike stood in his driveway, gazing at his newly restored garage. The tools and keepsakes that had once been carelessly displaced by Diana now sat neatly arranged, a testament to the hard-fought battle he had won. He took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. For the first time in months, his property felt like his again. Meanwhile, the fallout for Diana was swift and severe. Her reputation, once untouchable among HOA loyalists, was irreparably damaged. The very people she had manipulated and intimidated turned their backs on her. Within weeks, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. By the end of the month, her house stood empty, a silent reminder of how unchecked power can unravel. The HOA itself faced its reckoning. In a special meeting called by the remaining board members, a complete overhaul of leadership was proposed. New elections were held, and the community chose leaders who promised transparency and fairness. One of the newly elected members, Mrs. Garcia, stood proudly at the helm, vowing to make the HOA a force for good rather than a tool for control. For Mike, the victory wasn't just personal, it was transformative for the entire neighborhood. He often found himself reflecting on how the ordeal had brought the community closer. Neighbors who once lived in quiet isolation now exchanged greetings and offered help to one another. A sense of unity had replaced the tension Diana's rule had sown. One crisp evening, as Mike tidied up his garage, his daughter poked her head in. "Dad, are you going to tell this story to everyone forever?" she teased, her grin lighting up the room. Mike chuckled, setting down a wrench. "Maybe, but it's not just my story. It's ours. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter how hard it gets." The battle had been grueling, but it left Mike with something far greater than peace of mind. It left him with a stronger, more connected community and a renewed belief that even the most daunting challenges can be overcome. His victory was proof that no one, no matter how powerful they think they are, is above the law.